What if the limits we accept as human are not limits at all, but habits of expectation? The question lingers quietly beneath the surface of modern life, rarely spoken aloud. We trust our measurements, our instruments, our definitions of what a body can lift, what a mind can remember, what senses can perceive. And yet, scattered across history and quietly documented in hospitals, laboratories, and personal testimonies are moments when those definitions falter. This story begins not with spectacle, but with unease, a subtle discomfort that arises when evidence refuses to stay inside the lines we've drawn for it. Science, at its best, thrives on such discomfort. It advances by confronting anomalies, not ignoring them. And yet, some anomalies are so destabilizing that they are catalogued, studied, and then gently set aside like artifacts too strange to display. Imagine an ordinary day interrupted by something irreversible, a flash of lightning, a sudden silence after impact. When consciousness returns, the world is no longer arranged the same way. Numbers speak, space unfolds differently. Memory behaves like an unblinking recorder. These moments are not metaphors. They are events, described in clinical language and witnessed by professionals trained to doubt first and believe last. Across continents and decades, similar stories emerge. A blind child who learns to move through the world by sound, not as a compensation, but as a transformation. A woman who cannot forget, whose life is an unbroken thread of remembered Tuesdays and long-ago mornings. A parent who lifts impossible weight when fear leaves no room for hesitation. None of them asked to cross a boundary. None of them trained for it. Something simply unlocked. What ties these moments together is not miracle or myth, but a recurring suggestion that the human system contains more than it routinely reveals. That beneath our everyday functioning lies a deeper architecture, one rarely accessed and poorly understood. Not supernatural, not magical, just unexplored. Modern neuroscience tells us that the brain is adaptive, plastic, constantly rewiring itself. Yet even this explanation feels insufficient when confronted with abilities that appear fully formed, instantaneous, and precise. Calculations completed faster than machines, sensory maps drawn without eyes, bodies that ignore cold, pain, or exhaustion when survival demands it. These are not stories of superheroes. They are stories of janitors, children, parents, artists. People who did not set out to challenge scientific consensus, yet ended up doing so by accident. Their lives did not become easier because of these changes. Some became burdened by them. Others struggled to explain experiences for which language itself felt inadequate. And so we stand at an intersection. On one side, the comfort of known limits. On the other, a growing archive of human experiences that refuse to remain footnotes. The tension between these sides is not a conflict between belief and skepticism, but between curiosity and closure. This journey is not about proving that anything is impossible or miraculous. It is about listening carefully to what the evidence suggests when we stop trying to force it into familiar shapes. About asking whether evolution, biology, and consciousness have left us with unused margins, dormant pathways, or emergency doors we rarely open. Over the next chapters, we will move slowly through these lives and moments, not to sensationalize them, but to understand what they reveal about the relationship between mind and body, limitation and potential. Each story will raise its own questions, and none will offer final answers. Because perhaps the most important question is not how these abilities exist, but why they unsettle us so deeply. What do they threaten? Our theories, yes, but also our sense of who we are. If the human being is more than we regularly experience, what responsibility does that place on our understanding of ourselves? And what other capacities remain silent, waiting for circumstances we hope never arrive? The story begins here, in that quiet space between certainty and wonder. It started with a scream, sharp, high, and sudden, ripping through a cold morning in a small town in Canada. A mother, barely 5 feet tall, had just witnessed her young son pinned beneath the frame of a car in the driveway. Without thought, without hesitation, she ran and lifted the vehicle off his body. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as physics bowed, momentarily, to fear. What happened in that moment is now known as hysterical strength. It's rare, unpredictable, and profoundly unsettling. No one trains for it. It bypasses gym routines, ignores muscular conditioning, and appears only under extreme duress. The mother had never lifted more than groceries, but for those seconds she became something else, something beyond biology, beyond explanation. Doctors and scientists have long debated the mechanics behind such incidents. Theories range from adrenaline overload to temporary pain suppression and neural override. But none fully explain how tendons don't tear, how bones don't snap, how a body doesn't break under such weight. The chemical explanations are partial, helpful perhaps, but they feel like looking at a thunderstorm through a microscope, accurate yet utterly insufficient. What makes hysterical strength so fascinating is its silence. It doesn't announce itself beforehand. There's no build-up, no transformation sequence. It arrives in the instant of need, vanishing just as quickly. Those who experience it often report a strange calm afterward, followed by overwhelming exhaustion and disbelief. Some are never believed at all, and yet the stories persist. A teenager lifting a collapsed beam to free his father. A man holding up a crumbling wall to allow strangers to escape a burning building. A woman prying open the twisted steel of a car door after a crash. These are not tall tales passed down over centuries. They are documented, witnessed, recorded in emergency reports. Still, there's a reluctance to include them in serious scientific discussion, perhaps because they don't repeat reliably. You can't put someone in a lab, simulate horror, and ask them to lift a car. The ethical lines are unmovable, and so hysterical strength remains a scientific orphan, real but unspeakable. But what if we reframe the question? What if the body is more like a locked chest than a fixed machine? What if under specific conditions, conditions we instinctively avoid, there are keys we never knew we carried? The idea is uncomfortable because it suggests our daily strength is not our full strength, that our biology holds reserves we are mercifully never forced to access. Evolution doesn't waste resources. If this ability exists, it must have served a purpose. Perhaps in ancient times, it allowed parents to save children from predators or hunters to escape deadly traps. Maybe it's a biological fail-safe, an override system that only activates in moments of mortal urgency. But if that's true, then what else might be locked away in us? What systems lie dormant because the world no longer demands them? There's something humbling in these stories. They remind us that the line between ordinary and extraordinary is not fixed. It shifts with context, emotion, and instinct. And it is not only the body that transforms, it's the mind. In that fraction of a second, doubt disappears. There is no "I can't." There is only action. As the mother stood trembling in her driveway, the car now upright, her son breathing but bruised, the enormity of what had just occurred slowly returned to her. She collapsed, not from injury, but from awe, not of what she had done, but of what she had never known she could do, and perhaps that's the real message of hysterical strength, that we do not know ourselves as fully as we think. That buried deep in our biology is a mystery not meant for daily use, but for moments when love overpowers logic and fear transforms into impossible courage. Where does the body end and the will begin? And in those seconds of crisis, are we touching the edge of something ancient, forgotten, and entirely human? Picture a quiet room, its walls lined with books, the air still. A young girl sits cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, face relaxed, not in sleep but in something deeper. When she opens her eyes, she tells her doctor what she heard: the sound of a pen falling 4 rooms away, the click of a vending machine across the hallway, the whisper of shoes scuffing the stairwell. She isn't guessing. She's right, every time. This isn't science fiction. It's the lived experience of individuals with extraordinarily heightened senses, people whose hearing, sight, touch, or smell go beyond typical human perception. In medicine, they're often categorized as outliers. In life, they live somewhere between gifted and overwhelmed. Take the case of superhearing or hyperacusis. Some hear frequencies so subtle, so high-pitched or faint, that others dismiss them entirely. To them, a whisper isn't soft, it's sharp. A fluorescent light isn't a glow, it's a screech. For some, it becomes a torment. For others, it becomes a gateway to a different relationship with the world. Consider echolocation, not the domain of bats or whales, but humans. Certain blind individuals have developed the ability to navigate their environment using sound, creating mental maps by clicking their tongues and interpreting the echoes that return. Scientific studies have captured brain scans of these individuals. Their auditory cortex lights up in ways typically reserved for vision. Somehow, their brains have rewired reality. The boundaries between the senses blur. Synesthesia offers another crack in the wall. A person sees colors when they hear music, or tastes words as if they were flavors. It's not metaphor, it's perception, consistent, replicable, and vivid. For those who live with it, it's as natural as breathing, even if they can't explain it. Why do these abilities exist? Some theories suggest they're remnants of ancestral adaptations, heightened in a few. Others see them as the result of neuroplasticity, brains reshaping themselves in response to injury, need, or practice. But in every case, these abilities raise questions about the limits we assume. What if our senses are not fixed, but filtered? What if we only perceive what's useful, not what's possible? The human brain is a gatekeeper, not a spotlight. It edits far more than it illuminates. Perhaps those with heightened senses have doors left ajar, openings we've forgotten how to find. But this comes with cost. For every individual who thrives with enhanced perception, there are others who suffer. Too much input becomes noise. A gift becomes a burden. Sensory overload can isolate, confuse, and exhaust. Society isn't designed for those who hear too much, see too far, or feel too deeply. Still, these people exist, not as myths, but as evidence that perception is not a singular experience. Reality, it turns out, is tailored by the perceiver. And in that knowledge is something quietly radical, that the world around us may be infinitely richer than we allow ourselves to notice. That a tree may hum, a wall may echo, a color may speak, if only we had the wiring to hear it. The girl in the room returns to her silence. She does not brag. Her world is simply louder, closer, more alive. She has learned to live with it, not because it makes her special, but because it makes her different. And difference, as we'll see, is the thread that runs through all of these stories. If perception is a choice our brains make, what happens when those choices shift? And what realities lie just beyond the veil of ordinary experience, waiting for someone to hear them? A man walks into a cafe in San Diego and orders his usual. The barista smiles, recognizing him. He smiles back, but he doesn't remember her. He doesn't remember the cafe, the street, the city, but he remembers every day of his life since age 12. Not vaguely, exactly. Her name is Jill Price, and her condition was once thought impossible. She remembers what she ate on April 2nd, 1987. She can tell you what the weather was like, what was on television, what argument happened at school. It's called Highly Superior Autobiographical Memory, HSAM, and it challenges everything we think we know about memory. For most of us, memory is selective. We forget birthdays, appointments, names. We compress time. Days blur into years. But for those with HSAM, memory is not a library. It's a river. Constant, flowing, unfiltered. They don't recall the past. They live alongside it. When scientists began to study people like Jill, they were skeptical. Tests were administered, journals examined, personal diaries compared with public records. The memories checked out. Not only did these individuals remember, what they remembered matched reality with uncanny precision. But with this gift comes weight. The past never softens. Every heartbreak, every regret, every loss is accessible, raw and recent, even decades later. For Jill, forgetting is not an option. She describes it not as a talent, but a burden, like walking through life with a mirror on her back, constantly reflecting where she's been. Researchers have tried to understand why HSAM occurs. MRI scans reveal structural differences in the brain, particularly in regions linked to emotion and memory. But the exact cause remains unknown. There's no single gene, no definitive switch to turn it on or off. Some argue it's not memory alone, but obsession, a compulsive need to organize, catalog, revisit. Others suggest a cross-wiring between emotional intensity and recall. The truth is, we don't know. Not fully. Not yet. But HSAM invites us to rethink the role of forgetting. We often consider memory as a virtue, but forgetting is protective. It dulls pain. It frees us from the weight of yesterday. If you remembered every detail, would you still be able to live in the present? Memory is not just a recording device. It's an editor, a storyteller. It shapes who we are not by what it keeps, but by what it lets go. In that sense, those with HSAM are caught in a unique paradox. They remember more, but struggle to move on. And yet there's a beauty in it too, in the ability to walk backward through your life and find clarity, not confusion, in being able to say, with certainty, this is what happened, when the rest of us can only guess. Jill Price once said, "I don't look at time as something that passes. It just accumulates." Her life is not a timeline. It's a mosaic, each moment forever accessible, forever vivid. So we ask, what is memory really for? Is it to hold on to facts, or to help us let go? And if you could remember everything, would you still want to? In the next chapter, we'll step into the mind of someone who can do in seconds what most of us could never do in a lifetime. A human calculator, not just of numbers, but of time, pattern, and impossibility. He sat quietly in the corner of the room, eyes lowered, fingers tapping his knee in a steady rhythm. Around him, voices buzzed, numbers flew. Then someone handed him a calendar from 1982. What day was March 14th? He paused for less than a second. Sunday, he said. He was right. Every time he was right. Daniel Tammet is what some call a savant, but even that label fails to capture the breadth of his mind. He sees numbers as shapes, colors, even textures. Pi, to him, is not a string of digits. It's a landscape. His record? Reciting over 22,000 digits of pi from memory flawlessly over 5 hours. But the numbers are only part of the story. Tammet has a rare condition called synesthetic savant syndrome. It combines extraordinary mental ability with a vivid sensory way of experiencing abstract information. When he performs calculations, he doesn't solve them in the traditional sense. He sees the answers like snapshots arriving fully formed. Most of us were taught to view math as cold and rigid, locked behind symbols and steps. But in Tammet's world, numbers live and breathe. The number 4 is shy. 9 is loud. 37 feels like a prickly branch. This isn't metaphor. It's perception. And he's not alone. Throughout history, rare individuals have demonstrated astonishing mental feats. calculating cube roots of 6-digit numbers in seconds, learning new languages in days, memorizing entire books. They're often misunderstood, their abilities chalked up to genetic flukes or mysterious gifts. But dig deeper, and something more complex emerges. Many of these savants have unusual brain development, sometimes due to autism, sometimes due to injury, sometimes for no apparent reason at all. What unites them is not just raw talent, but access to cognitive processing most of us can't imagine. In Tamit's case, his brain seems to bypass conscious reasoning and access patterns directly. Where we would analyze, he simply sees. The mechanics are not entirely known, but they suggest that the mind has alternative pathways, routes we rarely travel, or perhaps never discover. This doesn't mean these individuals are superhuman. Many face immense challenges, socially, emotionally, physically. Their brilliance often exists alongside struggle. But their existence challenges the notion that intelligence is singular, linear, or uniform. What if intelligence isn't something we possess, but something we tune into? What if most of us operate on a narrow bandwidth, and people like Tamit have access to frequencies we can't hear? There's a humility in this realization. It reminds us that the mind is not a static organ, but a dynamic landscape, one shaped by biology, experience, trauma, and mystery. And sometimes, the edges of that landscape light up in ways that defy expectation. Tamit himself once said, "The real potential of the mind is to surprise us." He doesn't see his ability as magical. He sees it as deeply human, an extension of something we all carry in seed form. So we're left wondering, if perception can become vision and memory can become total recall, can intelligence become intuition? Are there ways of thinking we've yet to imagine, hidden architectures within us, waiting for a map? In the next chapter, we turn to something even stranger, not what the mind can do, but what it can know, without ever being taught. A child picks up a violin for the first time and plays. Not a single squeak or stumble. A melody emerges, fluid, emotive, familiar. Her parents watch, stunned. She's never had a lesson, never touched the instrument before. And yet the music flows as if remembered from another life. This is the mystery of innate knowledge, abilities that appear suddenly, fully formed, without instruction. Cases like these are rare, but persistent across time and cultures. A toddler speaking multiple languages without exposure. A boy who draws complex architectural blueprints without ever studying design. A teenager who sits at a piano and plays compositions as if channeling them. Science calls this phenomenon idiopathic savantism, when no injury or diagnosis explains the skill. But the term itself is an admission of uncertainty. Idiopathic simply means we don't know why. The prevailing theories suggest a few possibilities. One is genetic memory, traits or patterns encoded in DNA, passed through generations. Another is extreme neuroplasticity, allowing the brain to form connections at lightning speed when exposed to even minimal stimuli. Some propose hidden memories or subconscious learning, picked up in fragments and stitched together by an unusually attentive mind. But none of these theories explain the precision or the immediacy. What's striking is not just that these abilities appear, it's how refined they are. Like something waiting just beneath the surface, needing only a gentle nudge to emerge. In many cases, there is no training, no correction, no learning curve. There is only performance. These stories unsettle because they violate our sense of effort. We're taught that mastery comes from years of dedication. That expertise must be earned. But here are individuals who leap past the usual stages, who simply are what others strive to become. And yet these gifts often come with a price. Many who display sudden, untrained brilliance struggle socially, emotionally, or physically. Their talent becomes a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit. Sometimes it isolates rather than empowers. We also resist these stories because they suggest something we're not ready to admit, that we don't fully understand the mind's origins. That maybe somewhere in the structure of the brain, or even beyond it, there are layers we haven't mapped. That some knowledge may not be learned, but uncovered. The philosopher Plato once wrote of anamnesis, the idea that learning is remembering, that our souls contain knowledge from before birth, and education is merely the process of recalling it. Today, we smile at the poetry of such thinking. But when a 4-year-old plays Bach with no training, or a child solves equations meant for graduate students, the old ideas feel less quaint. Perhaps there are seeds in each of us, latent abilities waiting for the right trigger, a sound, a pattern, a moment of silence. Perhaps we carry more than we use. Perhaps we're built for more than survival. These are not easy ideas. They resist measurement, prediction, replication. But they invite a kind of humility, a recognition that the line between potential and mystery is thinner than we'd like to believe. And so we ask, if knowledge can arrive unbidden, what else might we carry unseen? What parts of ourselves lie dormant, not because they're absent, but because we've never been asked to call on them? In the next chapter, we look at a phenomenon that stretches not just the limits of learning, but the borders of time itself, a knowing that comes before the event, not after. It began, as these stories often do, with a feeling. A man wakes up from a vivid dream, disturbed and restless. In the dream, he sees a plane crash, flames, twisted metal, a specific flight number. He tells his wife, writes it down, and brushes it off. A week later, the same flight crashes. Everything matches. He isn't alone. Throughout history, people have described premonitions, uncanny glimpses of events yet to unfold. A mother wakes in the night moments before her child suffers a seizure. A soldier ducks for cover just before a bullet strikes where he stood. A commuter steps off a train at the last second, sensing something wrong, only to learn later it derailed. Skeptics call it coincidence, confirmation bias, pattern seeking in a chaotic world. But even among scientists, there's a quiet acknowledgement. Not all of these stories can be explained away so easily. In controlled experiments, subjects have been shown images, some neutral, some emotionally charged. What startled researchers was that milliseconds before the image appeared, certain physiological responses, heart rate, skin conductivity, began to change, as if the body knew what the eyes had not yet seen. These effects are small, inconsistent, and controversial. But they raise a provocative question. Can the mind perceive time differently under certain conditions? Are we, in some hidden way, entangled with the future? There are ancient names for this: prophecy, intuition, second sight. But the modern framing is quieter, anticipatory response. It doesn't claim certainty, only a subtle nudge, a whisper in the nervous system. Some theories suggest quantum effects in the brain might allow brief entanglements across time. Others propose a nonlinear perception of events, like memory, but reversed. Then there's the evolutionary idea. Perhaps, in rare moments, our ancestors' survival instincts surface as sudden foreknowledge. But the truth is, no one knows. Premonition sits at the border of science and myth, tolerated but rarely embraced. And yet, for those who experience it, the moment is undeniable, not because it proves anything, but because it feels different, urgent, true. There's danger in this space, of course. Not all predictions come to pass. And human memory is fragile, prone to revision. But the consistency of such stories, their emotional clarity, cannot be easily dismissed. We all know the feeling of déjà vu, the eerie sense that we've lived a moment before. But premonition is its mirror image, a memory from the future, a flicker that arrives too early, asking us to notice. Why does it matter? Because if even one instance of true premonition exists, just one, then our understanding of time, causality, and consciousness must expand. It would suggest that the mind is not a passive observer of events, but an active participant in a fabric more complex than linear time allows. And perhaps that's what unsettles us most. That we are not just beings moving through time, but beings partially shaped by moments we haven't yet lived. So the man writes his dream down, not because he expects to be right, but because he feels something. And in doing so, he becomes a question mark in the flow of history. A reminder that knowledge doesn't always arrive through logic. What if the future isn't a fixed point, but a spectrum of possibility we sometimes glimpse by accident? And what part of us, unknown and unnamed, is listening to echoes from ahead? In the next chapter, we turn inward, to a space where time dissolves completely, where people leave their bodies behind and return changed forever. It usually starts on the edge of death. A car crash, a surgical table, a fall through ice. In those final seconds, when breath halts and heartbeat fades, something extraordinary happens. A sensation of floating, of watching oneself from above, of passing through light, meeting presences, feeling an overwhelming peace. Then, suddenly, a return. The body pulls them back. These are known as near-death experiences, or NDEs, documented in every culture, every religion, and in every corner of the world. They share eerie commonalities: the tunnel, the light, the life review, the sense of timelessness. And always the same feeling upon return, that what they experienced was more real than reality. Science has tried, and continues to try, to explain them. The leading theories speak of oxygen deprivation, neurochemical surges, or a final burst of brain activity before shutdown. And yet, these explanations feel partial. They might account for fragments, but not for the coherence, the clarity, the emotional impact that endures for decades afterward. Perhaps what makes NDEs most compelling is not what people see, but how they change. Many who return from the brink no longer fear death. They speak of an interconnectedness, a sense that consciousness does not end with the body. They often abandon material pursuits, drawn instead to meaning, service, or simplicity. This shift is not subtle. Researchers have noted profound transformations in personality, values, and worldview. It's as if the experience reorients the compass of the self. Skeptics argue that such changes can be explained psychologically: trauma, gratitude, the shock of survival. But survivors insist it's more than that. It wasn't just a dream. It wasn't hallucination. It was a knowing. Among the most fascinating aspects are veridical perceptions, accounts of people seeing or hearing things while clinically dead, which are later verified, descriptions of surgical instruments used, conversations had in nearby rooms, even specific clothing worn by others, despite the patient being unconscious and unresponsive at the time. Of course, these cases are rare and hard to study, but even a handful of them raises profound questions. Where is consciousness located? Is it entirely a product of the brain, or can it, under extreme conditions, exist apart from it? This idea is not new. Ancient spiritual traditions have long described the soul as something distinct from the body. What's new is that people with no interest in mysticism, doctors, pilots, engineers, now describe these experiences with striking consistency, and they are changed by them. Whether NDEs are glimpses of an afterlife or a final trick of the brain, they reveal something essential: that consciousness is not simply a biological function. It is also a mystery, a frontier not fully mapped. To those who've crossed that threshold, the question of what happens after death is no longer philosophical. It is personal. They carry the imprint of a place with no coordinates, no words, only feeling. In a world obsessed with proof, NDEs remain unprovable. But they endure because they speak to something deeper than evidence: the human longing for continuity, for connection, for peace in the face of the unknown. So we ask, what if death is not an end, but a passage? And what if, for a few moments, some among us have already walked its edge and returned, not with answers, but with a softened gaze? In the next chapter, we shift from death to life itself, from those who momentarily leave the body to those who seem to transcend its limits entirely. The mountain air was thin, but he felt nothing. Shirtless in the snow, surrounded by ice, his skin was flushed with cold, but his body remained calm. No shivering, no numbness, no hypothermia. The man was Wim Hof, nicknamed the Iceman, and he was meditating in sub-zero temperatures as if it were a summer breeze. What makes his story remarkable isn't just the feat. It's that he's taught others to do it too. For centuries, stories circulated of monks in the Himalayas using a practice called tummo to generate inner heat, drying wet sheets with body warmth alone while meditating in freezing conditions. These tales were dismissed as legend until modern science caught up. Wim Hof submitted himself to tests. Researchers measured his body's response to cold, monitored his immune system, and watched in disbelief as he consciously influenced functions long considered automatic. His breathing techniques and mental focus seemed to unlock access to systems that, by textbook definitions, should be inaccessible. He trained others. They too learned to control their body temperature, reduce inflammation, and even suppress symptoms of injected pathogens, all using breath and focus. What does this mean? That the autonomic nervous system, long thought to be beyond our control, might not be so autonomous after all. That with training, intention, and perhaps something more ancient than science yet understands, humans can consciously alter the very processes that keep us alive. Skeptics, of course, called it dangerous. Others claimed it was extreme biology, not replicable. But repeated studies have shown measurable changes, reduced stress hormones, heightened immune responses, shifts in body chemistry. At its heart, this is not about breaking records or walking barefoot across glaciers. It's about the boundary between will and body. How much of what we consider natural limits are simply untested assumptions? Modern life dulls the edges of physical challenge. We insulate, medicate, and automate discomfort. But ancient practices, from yoga to breathwork to fasting, suggest a different kind of relationship with the body. One where discomfort is a teacher, not a threat. Wim Hof's techniques are not mystical, they're repeatable, yet the results feel like magic. A reminder that the body, when paired with deep intention, is capable of more than comfort allows. What's striking is how quickly people adapt. After just a few days of training, participants in studies show measurable physiological changes. It suggests that these abilities aren't mutations or miracles, they're dormant capacities we've forgotten how to reach. Perhaps evolution doesn't eliminate the extraordinary. Perhaps it just hides it until it's needed again. And so we ask, if we can influence immune function, temperature regulation, even adrenaline at will, what else might be within our reach? What other systems have been closed, not by biology, but by belief? The Iceman sits in silence, surrounded by snow, his breath slow and steady. He is not conquering the cold. He is remembering something we've all forgotten, that the body is not a cage, but a gateway. In the next chapter, we explore another human threshold, not of physical endurance, but of spiritual vision. A state where people claim to leave the waking world entirely, entering realms beyond time and language. A woman lies still in a dim room, eyes closed, breath shallow. Around her, silence. Then, slowly, she begins to speak, not in her own voice, but in a tone and rhythm unlike anything her family recognizes. Her words come from somewhere else, describing scenes, symbols, places she has never seen. She calls it a journey. Others call it astral projection. Across time and cultures, people have reported the sensation of leaving their physical body and traveling elsewhere, floating above their beds, drifting through walls, visiting distant cities or other worldly landscapes. To some, it's a spiritual practice. To others, a neurological illusion. But for those who experience it, the sensation is unshakably real. The term astral projection comes from ancient mystic traditions, but the experience itself appears in countless forms. Shamans describe soul flight. Tibetan monks speak of dream yoga. Indigenous healers recount spirit journeys. Always there is the common thread, the separation of consciousness from the body. In the 20th century, researchers at the Monroe Institute attempted to study this phenomenon systematically. Using sound frequencies known as hemisync, they induced altered states of awareness in volunteers, some of whom reported out-of-body experiences with vivid, reproducible detail. Skeptics argue that these are dreams, lucid imaginations, or disassociations caused by sleep paralysis or neurological phenomena. Indeed, brain scans during such states show activity in regions associated with vision and movement, even when the body is still. But some accounts push the boundaries of coincidence. A woman under anesthesia later describes the tools used during her surgery. A blind person recounts visual details of a room they've never seen. Again, these stories are rare, but persistent. What's more important than the destination of these journeys is the shift in perspective they bring. People who experience astral projection often return changed, more empathetic, less fearful of death, more attuned to the interconnectedness of life. Whether they traveled to another dimension or navigated their own inner cosmos, the effect is lasting. Could it be that the human mind, under certain conditions, simulates the sensation of flight, of separation, as a coping mechanism? Or is consciousness less localized than we believe, capable of existing independently of the physical frame? Modern science is rooted in measurement, but astral projection resists measurement by nature. It is personal, internal, subjective, and yet it echoes across cultures like a forgotten language we all once spoke. Even those who dismiss it as fantasy must wrestle with the question, why does the experience feel so real? Why do people, across centuries and geographies, describe the same floating, the same silver cord, the same clarity? Perhaps this is not about proving the soul's travel, but about understanding the architecture of inner space. The landscapes of consciousness are vast, and most of us explore only a fraction of them. The woman opens her eyes, her breathing deepens. She cannot explain where she went, only that it was quiet, luminous, and outside the reach of time. So we ask, what is the true shape of awareness? Is the self something that can detach, observe, return? And if so, what does that say about who, or what, we really are? In the next chapter, we step into an even more delicate realm, where the mind may not travel far, but instead taps into something, someone else. A knowing that does not come from within, but seems to arrive from beyond. She was only 6 when it started. Her parents noticed first, the way she spoke of places she'd never been, names no one had taught her, events far too detailed for imagination. She described a past life, they said, not a dream, a memory. These stories emerge quietly, often in early childhood. A boy in India who knows intimate details of a stranger's life and death. A toddler in the U.S. who cries for his other mother and recognizes old photographs with no prior exposure. In many cases, the memories fade as the child grows. But while they last, they are vivid, insistent. The idea of reincarnation is ancient. From Hindu texts to Buddhist teachings to early Christian sects, the belief that souls return has endured. But in the modern era, it's taken on a new layer, because now it's being studied. Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, spent decades investigating over 2,000 cases of children claiming past life memories. He looked for patterns, birthmarks that matched fatal wounds, behaviors unusual for the child's environment, verifiable details about the deceased. His work was rigorous, cautious, and often uncomfortable. The results? Not proof, but possibility. Some cases were easily dismissed: suggestion, media influence, family bias. but others resisted easy explanation. Children named towns they'd never visited, recalled relationships in lives long ended, and in rare instances met people from those past lives, reacting with emotion too deep to fake. Science remains skeptical. Memory is malleable. The human mind, especially a child's, is impressionable. But what if some of these memories aren't imagined? What if they're retrieved? One theory suggests cryptomnesia, where forgotten information resurfaces without the person realizing its source. Another points to subconscious absorption. But these still don't explain memories that match obscure details or people long dead and unknown to the child's environment. The question, then, isn't whether reincarnation is real, but what memory truly is. Are we carriers of stories older than our names? Is the mind a vessel, a receiver, or something more collective? There's also an emotional dimension. Children with these memories often feel torn between families, identities, timelines. It's not romantic. It's disorienting. And as the memories fade, some express grief, like waking from a dream where they once belonged. These experiences don't demand belief in the supernatural. They invite us to consider continuity, not just of consciousness, but of story. That perhaps we are not single, sealed beings, but part of a longer narrative arc we can't fully see. If true, it changes everything about how we see life and death. It reframes tragedy. It challenges finality. It suggests that endings may be thresholds, not stops. The girl now draws pictures of a village she's never visited. She speaks less often of her other home as she grows, but when asked, her gaze turns distant. "I still remember," she says softly. "I just don't talk about it anymore." So we ask, are these echoes from a deeper self or artifacts of imagination? And if part of us lives before and beyond the body, what does that make us? In the next chapter, we explore a different kind of knowledge, one not remembered from another life, but shared between minds, across silence. A phenomenon so intimate it blurs the boundaries of self and other. Telepathy. Two sisters, seated across the room, say nothing. One suddenly starts to laugh. The other joins her a beat later, without knowing why. A thought, a memory, a joke not spoken, but felt. This isn't coincidence. It happens too often. They call it a connection. Others call it telepathy. The idea of mind-to-mind communication has long belonged to the realm of fiction and the fringe. But beneath the sensational headlines and sci-fi imagery, quieter stories persist. Twins who finish each other's sentences, friends who sense danger miles apart. A mother who wakes in the night, inexplicably gripped by fear, only to learn her child was injured at that exact moment. In experiments over the decades, researchers have tried to study telepathy under controlled conditions. Two people isolated in separate rooms, one sending a mental image, the other trying to receive it. Results are mixed, statistically significant in some trials, indistinguishable from chance in others. The scientific community remains divided. Some dismiss the idea entirely. Others believe our tools simply aren't refined enough yet. But the question lingers. Is thought truly confined to the skull, or is consciousness more like a field, diffuse, relational, and occasionally entangled? Modern physics offers some curious parallels. Quantum entanglement shows that particles separated by vast distances can influence each other instantaneously. Might the brain, a quantum system in part, have access to similar non-local properties? It's speculative, but not impossible. But not. What makes telepathy so provocative is not the novelty, but the intimacy. To truly read another's mind is not just to access their knowledge, but to feel their interior world, their fear, their memory, their love. And yet, most reported instances of telepathy are not full conversations. They're flashes, impressions, a sudden knowing. It's not about words, it's about presence. The most credible accounts tend to arise in moments of high emotion, crisis, love, trauma, deep connection. It suggests that the key may not be effort, but attunement. The more emotionally bonded two people are, the more likely they are to experience these moments. It's less like tuning a radio and more like two instruments vibrating to the same invisible rhythm. Skeptics argue that our brains are skilled at spotting patterns, even where none exist, that these experiences are simply products of coincidence amplified by memory. And yet, for those who've felt it, the sensation is unmistakable. A thought that isn't yours, but feels close. A word that arrives before it's spoken. We're left in a curious place, between hard science and soft knowing, between brain and heart. And perhaps that's where telepathy truly lives, not as a superpower, but as a reminder of how connected we already are. In a world growing louder, with endless devices to speak and share, telepathy asks a quieter question. What if the deepest form of communication needs no words at all? The sisters return to their silence, smiling. No one else in the room understands why, but for a moment they were in the same place, together without moving. And so we wonder, is the mind truly private, or is there a deeper language we all once knew and occasionally remember? In the next chapter, we turn to a phenomenon at once ancient and urgent, when knowledge arrives in dreams, revealing things the waking self could not possibly know. She dreamed of a place she had never seen, its winding streets, a stone fountain, a red door with a cracked frame. When she awoke, the images clung to her like mist. A week later, on a spontaneous trip, she turned a corner in a foreign town and froze. There it was, the fountain, the door, every detail from her dream, waiting for her. Dreams are the most democratic of mysteries. Every night, billions of people enter that realm, shifting, surreal, often forgotten. Yet within this nightly theater, some dreams step out of fiction and into fact. They show us truths we've yet to learn. Warnings, insights, answers to questions we haven't asked. This phenomenon is called precognitive dreaming, when the future arrives in sleep. It has been recorded throughout history. Abraham Lincoln dreamt of his own funeral days before his assassination. Mark Twain foresaw his brother's death in vivid detail. Across time, cultures, and belief systems, dreams have served as messengers. Skeptics say it's random, that dreams are chaotic, and given enough of them, some will appear prophetic by chance. And that's true. Most dreams are noise, but others? They carry a precision that defies probability. In laboratories, dream studies have attempted to test this. In rare cases, participants have reported details about future events with uncanny specificity. But replication is hard. Dreams resist control. They unfold on their own terms. What makes precognitive dreams so striking is not just their content, it's how they feel. People describe a clarity, a lucidity, a weight that distinguishes them from ordinary dreams. As if the mind, unburdened by waking logic, can see further. Why might this happen? Some scientists suggest that dreams help the brain process data beneath our awareness. Tiny signals, patterns, subconscious clues, stitched together into predictions. Others wonder whether time, in altered states of consciousness, might lose its linear flow. Spiritual traditions offer different explanations. That dreams are a doorway. That in sleep the soul travels. That what we receive in dreams comes not from within, but from beyond, a higher self, a collective memory, even ancestors. Regardless of the theory, the effect is the same. People awaken changed. They make different choices. They seek, they avoid, they prepare. Sometimes they save lives. Sometimes they simply pay attention. But there's a deeper question here, beyond prediction. What is dreaming for? Is it a nightly theater of memory and emotion? or a sandbox for the soul, a neurological fluke, or a forgotten language. Modern science is beginning to accept that dreams are more than random firings. They may play a role in problem-solving, creativity, even healing. Some artists and inventors credit dreams with their breakthroughs, ideas that arrived fully formed in the quiet hours of sleep. So perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. Not whether dreams predict the future, but whether they open a door to parts of ourselves that already know. The woman stands before the red door, stunned. She does not know why she dreamed it or what it means. But in that moment, she feels connected, woven into something larger than coincidence. And so we ask, what part of us wanders while we sleep? And what truths wait in that darkness, whispering beneath the veil of reason? In our final chapter, we return to the ground beneath all these stories, the human being, not as a vessel of mystery, but as the mystery itself. What does it mean to be more than we think? To carry within us a map we've barely begun to read? There is a quiet moment in the life of every person when they realize the map they were given doesn't show all the roads. It might be standing in front of a painting that moves you for reasons you can't explain. It might be waking from a dream that still echoes in your chest. It might be lifting something you shouldn't be able to lift, knowing something you were never taught, feeling the presence of someone miles away. We call these anomalies, glitches, exceptions. But what if they're not exceptions at all? What if they're glimpses? Throughout this journey, we've met individuals who remember every day of their lives, who navigate the world with sound, who tap into knowledge beyond instruction, who glimpse futures in sleep and awaken changed. These are not superheroes. They are us. Unmasked, unexpected. Each ability we've explored, whether savant calculation, telepathic connection, out-of-body experience, or near-death revelation, suggests the same quiet truth. The boundary of what it means to be human is not fixed. It is porous, expanding. Science is still catching up, and that's not a criticism. It is the nature of discovery to trail behind the mystery. For every theory we build, reality leaves breadcrumbs just out of reach, inviting us not to conquer the unknown, but to grow into it. But in that gap between knowledge and mystery lies something else. Humility. Not the kind that diminishes, but the kind that opens us. To wonder, to empathy, to awe. Because the real subject of these stories is not phenomena, it's people. People who endure, adapt, and carry questions they may never answer. People who are changed, not just by what they can do, but by what they feel in the process. To live with unexplainable experience is to live at the edge of language. But maybe that's where we find our deepest truths, not in certainty, but in resonance. Not in facts alone, but in the feeling that something vast lives within us. This doesn't mean abandoning skepticism. It means expanding it. Asking not just, is this real, but what else could real mean? There's a reason we're drawn to these stories, not because they confirm our fantasies, but because they remind us of something we've sensed all along, that we are more complex, more capable, and more connected than we usually remember. In the end, the human body is not a prison. The mind is not a closed room. We are thresholds, bridges between what is known and what is possible. And in those rare moments when something breaks through, when we lift the car, hear the unseen, remember the impossible, we are offered a glimpse of the unfinished masterpiece we are. So the question is not whether these abilities are real. The question is, what will we do with the knowledge that we are, each of us, more than we seem? Will we ignore it, exploit it, or will we nurture it, quietly, curiously, together? The map is not complete. It never was. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real human ability is not any single talent, but the capacity to grow into our own mystery. And perhaps in doing so, we learn the most astonishing truth of all, that the frontier we're chasing out there has always been waiting within us. Here, where science meets story, where the unknown becomes a mirror, where being human is the greatest wonder of all.